Here's the problem. Most people use Claude Code, Hermes agent, and OpenClaw as a single session chatbot style interface on Telegram or on laptop or in terminal. The problem is these agentic frameworks or harnesses are capable of much more. And you can even deploy 50 agents or 50 instances or persistent agents or subagents, agent teams, and turn it into a proper agentic company. Or you can use it to collaborate with your human employees or teammates. So in this video, I want to go over with you multi-agent orchestration to go from a single session, sequential, you prompt, you get the answer, you prompt, you get the answer, to something much more scalable, cheaper in some instances, and much better quality than in the single session example. So multi-agent orchestration is different in Claude Code, in OpenClaw, and Hermes. And each one of them solves it in a different way. And we'll go over which one is better for which purpose, and you will know exactly which one you should use for which type of work. Let's go over this presentation. I wanted to explain this in a little bit layman's terms. So I don't want to go into like subagents, agent teams, persistent agents, and so on. So the number one we showed here is the talk. So one agent, one session, you prompt, you get the answer. And this is great. And we've been using that with Claude Code or Cursor or any other IDE for over a year. And recently we have this sort of agentic multi-agent structure. It started with subagents in Claude Code, and pretty much every harness from there started using it. So fan out basically means you can start subagents, and that means you can send one agent to do the research, one subagent to do the design, one subagent to come up with the titles, one subagent to come with a description, and so on. And they all come back to the main agent and with the result. And then your main agent will use those results to create the output that you desire. So the problem with these is that they don't persist. So your main agent spawns them, and then after they finish the work, they disappear. And OpenClaw kind of opened this new dimension of persistent agents. There were solutions before that, of course, but OpenClaw made it more popular and more even viral, essentially, and we all know about it right now because of that. So persistent agents means it has its own memory, it has its own workspace, its own soul, MD, agents, MD files, so instructions for the agents, and it can have many other things inside of that workspace. So that's great from a standpoint that you can actually feel like you're talking to another human being, right? Or something that has a soul or a name, and it feels like a true employee or assistant. Whereas in Claude Code, it just feels like a robot, basically. It just does the work, creates the output, and creates great output, but it still doesn't feel like a teammate. Claude Code uses subagents, and you can define these agents in .claude.agents. So these can be instructions. For example, you can have a designer subagent, MD, or coder, and things like that. And you can instruct your Claude Code in .claude MD, so in the root instruction of your Claude Code, to use these subagents for tasks. And the important bit here is that your agent has limited context, whether it's 1 million or 400K, or it doesn't matter, it depends on what model you use. That fills up very fast. And the more it fills, the more your agent starts to drift and hallucinate. That's why we need to use subagents for actually doing the work. So you can go back and forth, explain what you want, and then we have a 5, 6, 7, 10 step process that we need to implement. And your agent would then send out subagents to do the task and return, keeping the original context clean. And that is very important. So context management is very important. You will pay less for your API credits or for your usage in Claude Code as well. Subagents get their own prompt. They get their own clean session no previous context other than what they get from the orchestrator agent. And once they return the output, they disappear. So their context is killed. There is no more. So imagine that as you hire some freelancer on Upwork or Fiverr, and he does some job for you and pretty much forgets about you the moment you say it's fine. And that's basically how it works. The thing with Claude Code is that you're locked into this Anthropic ecosystem, so pretty much 3 models that you can use. And these are great models, but still, for certain tasks, you might want to use other models. There are ways to use other models in Claude Code, even local models, but this is beyond the scope of this video, so it's pretty advanced. I'll make new videos about how you can use local models inside of Claude Code and essentially making Claude Code free. Let's go over Hermes. So Hermes is basically built on top of the idea of OpenClaw. So Hermes has 2 ways of delegating. It can delegate by the delegate task command, and it's essentially what in Claude Code subagents are. And there is also something called persistent profiles, and these are what workspaces are, agent workspaces are in OpenClaw, and we'll get to that. And these can be triggered by chat-p, and you're giving it a prompt. So you're essentially triggering the profile to be the subagent and not the ephemeral subagent using delegate task. Different things for different needs, obviously. If you want a workflow to feel more like a collaboration, you would use the profiles. And if you need parallel work where you have 50 files to process, then you would use delegate task and delegate it to 5 or 10 subagents, and they all return work to the main agent. So for profiles, you can have a designer, you can have a coder, you can have a research QA, whatever you can imagine, pretty much like in OpenClaw. And many people have said that Hermes makes a really good orchestrator for OpenClaw, and some people use both. And it's obviously possible. You can even use Claude Code inside of Hermes, which is amazing. And it has by far the best memory, and it also self-improves the skills and so on. It's a bit double-edged sword because you can end up with 50, 100 newly made skills that you don't even have an idea what those are. So just something to be mindful of. And we have the OpenClaw, which basically opened up the whole idea of using persistent agents. Each agent has its own soul. Even in Hermes, each agent has its own soul and memory files. OpenClaw has this workspace where you can put a lot more. You can put examples, you can put scripts, tools, whatever that agent needs. So it's more scoped as like a full persistent agent. Whereas in Hermes, you imply and you tell it, hey, like you can use these 10 skills, but don't use the other 50. So workspace is also not isolated by default. It can be done in options in OpenClaw, but it's a bit clunky. I didn't really get it to work as I wanted. Subagents also support, and you can even set the depth of these subagents. So your orchestrator can trigger another like designer, and then designer can spawn 10 different subagents that will return 10 different variations of a design. So that would be a use case. So OpenClaw feels more like creating an actual team. And that was the intent. So having an assistant, like a chief of staff, and then having 5, 10 other agents that feel like teammates, they have names, and you can collaborate and things like that. I even made it like a whole Kanban board, and they would comment, they would go back and forth. It's pretty much like bot to bot in Telegram, but it didn't really get stuck in an infinite loop in there. But I completely switched to Hermes because of the memory. I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. With OpenClaw, you need to work on the memory, whether you use Obsidian, whether you use like Pinecone or any other database for these memories. So you need to work a bit on the memory, pretty much like you would if you want memory in Claude Code. But Hermes has really good memory. Whatever I ask from 3 days, 5 days, 7 days ago, it remembers everything. So yeah, that's pretty much the overview. When I would use OpenClaw is for building this sort of agentic team. And you can even use Hermes agent on top to be your main point of contact with the OpenClaw team, and the OpenClaw team can execute tasks. The main reason why you would want to use persistent agents is you can define models, you can define providers, you can have multiple providers. Hermes even allows you to set up 2, 3, let's say codex subscriptions. And if one gets exhausted, the other one takes over. So you would never pretty much run out of tokens. So subagents, as we discussed, to wrap it up, spawn, do one task, return a summary, vanish. No memory, perfect for parallel, one-off work. Persistent agents, long-lived, named, have their own memory, good with role, strategy, continuity, anything that lives outside of a single task. So if you have a workflow, I would use persistent agents. If those persistent agents need to do parallel work, I would use subagents. And so if you're shipping code or let's say video production or something, I would use Claude Code. And it just, for example, if I wanted to do like a transcription of this video and animate it and do these things, or even put 2000 MD files of transcripts of sales calls and run a Python script where we'll analyze everything, I would do it in Claude Code. So like these one-off tasks that don't really require orchestration, thinking, going through different models and things like that, I would do it in Claude Code. If you're running daily automations, content pipelines, whatever, link building, I would use either Hermes or OpenClaw. Try both is my recommendation and see what works for you. If you like the idea of building this agent team with identity and memory, I would say out of the box, OpenClaw offers more of that, but you will have less of a memory system out of the box. And if you just go and punch out code, I would use, obviously, Claude Code. So that pretty much wraps it up. It's every tool or every harness has its own use. And you just see, maybe you want to use Claude Code and then Hermes, or Claude Code and OpenClaw, or Hermes and OpenClaw. It's up to you. Like I would try all three and see what works for you, what works for your brain, for your system, for your business. And there is no right or wrong here. I just wanted you to know how these harnesses deal with subagents and orchestration. That's all for this video. Thank you.